Hi, and welcome to CommieCast, a series of podcasts from the Communist Party of Britain, taking you on Britain's road to socialism, talking about the big issues of today and how we can make things better. I'm Stewart McGill, convener of the Communist Party's Political Economy Commission. Today, I'm joined by Ruth Stiles and Lorraine Douglas, comrades from the party who have both spent decades in local authorities and or the voluntary sector here in South East London, working in various aspects of the provision of housing. This is the first in a series of podcasts about the housing crisis in this country. So, as you're about to hear, their experience will be invaluable in explaining how we got here and what is to be done to get us out of this capitalist created mess. Right. Let's talk about the current state of this market and crisis, or perhaps, well, some would say it's an emergency. A quick resume of where we are here. One of the things that shocked me in the research for this is that low-paid key workers on the front line of COVID-19 wouldn't be able to afford the average priced home in 98% of Great Britain, which is a scandal when you think about it. A nurse with a partner on the average wage would be locked out of the market in more than 20% of areas. And in some parts of the country, they got low deposit mortgages, but they're no help because the would-be homeowners can't afford the monthly repayments on the mortgages, leaving them in a position they need to go ahead and save large sums to put down. Now, one of the results of this is housing benefit is huge. Expenditure on housing benefits in 2021-22 was forecast to be 30.3 billion. That's obviously exaggerated by some of the fallout of the pandemic, but the figures remain astonishing. I think in 1999, housing benefit was 11 billion. By 2019, it reached 23 billion. Now, in some perspective, housing benefit is 3% of total public spending, and that's about 1.1% of national income. That dwarfs the spending on the police, overseas aid, and the budgets of many entire government departments. To get over this, we need to build 325,000 new, genuinely affordable homes every year, just to meet demographic changes. This wouldn't meet the current backlog, and we haven't built that many homes since 1970. Now, let's look at the house price growth and how it compares with salaries. Since 2000, UK house price growth has significantly outpaced the rise in average earnings. Average house in March 21 was 65 times the average UK home in January 1970. So house prices March 21, 65 times the average of what they were in Jan 70. Average weekly wages only 36 times higher. The average weekly wage, which was apparently 616 in March 21, it would take more than 416 weeks to buy the average UK property outright. And that's if you spend none of what you earn. The crisis is obviously acute in cities such as London. We'll talk about London as a special case a little bit later. Looking at some figures here, I think that in London right now, house prices are over 15 times the median salary in the region. In the West Midlands, 8 times the median salary. North East is the best region, just 6 times the median salary. London and the South East are by far the worst. The South East is actually 12 times median salary. So you're talking about very difficult for the vast majority of people to afford anywhere. This, of course, has a knock-on effect on rents because people can't get in the housing market. They go in the rental market, and that puts rentals prices up, particularly when you have limited supply, something we'll talk about later. In 2020, in England as a whole, rent would eat up 45.5% of your net salary. In London, that figure was 75%. So we're talking about, this is why we talk about this as an emergency rather than the crisis. Speaking of crisis, the Crisis Charity, their figures showed a 94% increase in homelessness since 2013 and a 165% in overall homelessness since 2010. Let's look at local to us here in Greenwich. 40% of current applicants for a council house have been on the waiting list for more than 5 years. Lambeth, number of people on the waiting list, 36,000. The average length of time a person spends on that waiting list, 6.5 years. In Lewisham, 2,000 people have been on the list for a permanent home for more than a decade. Of the 9,000, well, over 9,000 waiting between 3 and 10 years, 65% have been waiting for 3 or more years. Southwark, over 15,000 people on the waiting list, which the council says highlights the importance of their pledge to build 11,000 new council homes across the borough by 2043. So that's 2043, a long way off. And of course, when you think of the homes that we lost whenever they took the Haygate down in Southwark, we'll talk about that later, and that will emphasise some of the problems we have here. Okay, hope that's given a reasonable summary of where we are right now. Lorraine, all right, when I first came to London in the late 70s and into the early 80s, it was easy to get a place. All right, I think at the time in the country, something like 42% of people lived in council houses. Now it's about 7 or 8%. So I'm assuming there's some connection between that decline in the number of people in council houses. What happened in the 80s to give us the disaster we're living in now?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back very quickly in case we lose it, just on the question of housing waiting lists and the numbers on waiting lists. And if Southwark's got 13,000 on its housing waiting list, that is potentially an indication of severe housing need in the borough, because the majority or a significant number of local authorities have now restricted access to the waiting list only to those people who actually have some sort of a priority or some sort of measured housing need. It is not a measure of demand. Housing registers were never indicators of housing need. You could extrapolate to find out the people who were in the most serious housing need, but they were always measures of demand. And notwithstanding the fact that housing registers across the country have been closed to applicants who, you know, don't stand a chance of getting a council tenancy in the current circumstances. There's still over 1 million households on housing registers. And in boroughs where they don't restrict the need, don't restrict access to the registers, you will see vastly greater numbers of people on those registers. Greenwich, I think, was a case in point, or was a case in point. And the argument that is used for restricting access is because of the cost of maintaining a housing register. That's the reasoning behind it. Of course, the real indication is to show a reduced demand for council housing, which of course these figures don't show at all. But nevertheless, 13,000 people in the London Borough of Southwark in significant housing need is a huge number. I mean, you're looking at between 5 and 10% of the population in Southwark actually registered as having a real housing need, with no prospect of that being met in an affordable sense between now and the middle of this century. So, you know, by which time that housing need will continue to increase. So going back to the history, yes, you're absolutely right. Around 42% of all homes in Britain in 1979 were council tenancies. The housing association sector was tiny at around 6%, and the private rented sector was also tiny in 1979 for much the same reasons. And you contrast that, you've got to go back even further. If you go back to the period at the turn of the 20th century, around 80% of the population were living in the private rented sector. So what we can see is that there has actually been a huge turnaround in tenure, in property ownership, and also in the provision of housing, where it was once primarily the preserve of private landlords. Throughout the 20th century, that shifted very significantly to see a huge growth in owner occupation, at the same time as we saw a huge growth in council housing happening. And just to give an indication, it was the standard position of mortgage lenders, which were almost exclusively building societies. Banks didn't do mortgage lending. It was building societies that did that primarily, or banks didn't do it to the same degree. It was 2.5 times your income was the maximum mortgage that you could get. The first house that my parents bought in 1966 was £6,000. So at a maximum 2.5%. The second house they bought, which was in 1969, which was in London, the first house was in Kent. The second one in London was £9,000. So that will give an indication really of what property prices are like. The third house they bought was, I think, £19,000. That was a bit bigger, a bit nicer. It was detached. It was around the corner from where we were previously living. That property was sold for around £700,000 a couple of years ago. So it will give you an indication of just what has happened with house price inflation. Now, what led to that? Well, 1977, under the Callaghan government, I think it still was at that stage, we saw the passing of the Homelessness Act, which was the culmination of 10 years campaigning after Ken Loach's seminal film, Cathy Come Home. And it was the first time that people had a legal right to assistance with housing if they were homeless. By 1982 and the election of following the election of Thatcher, we had the introduction of the right to buy legislation. And in the ensuing period, we've seen 2 million council homes sold under the right to buy. It's worth noting that with the introduction in 1996 of buy-to-let mortgages, some 40% of those council homes are now in the hands of buy-to-let landlords. The majority of them, or a very significant number of them, in London, and now being rented back by local authorities in a larger number of cases to accommodate homeless families as temporary accommodation, or putting them into assured short-hold tenancies in order to end the homelessness duty at around 3 times what they'd be paying if they were still council homes. So there's the principal cause of your growth in the housing benefit bill. It is probably worth saying, and I haven't quantified them here, but I think housing is probably one of the areas that has seen the most amount of legislation as an issue passed over the last 40 odd years. And since the election of the Thatcher government, I think it would be fair to say that the vast majority of the legislation that has been passed has been geared towards accelerating the privatisation of socially owned housing. That's been the impact. So in 1988, the Housing Act abolished the regulation of the private rented sector, did away with rent controls, did away with security of tenure, created assured short-hold tenancies, and on top of that, it exhorted local authorities to transfer their remaining housing stock to the housing association sector. I'll have a break there.
Okay, interesting stuff. Ruth, in your area at the time, what impact did you see from the various bits of legislation that Lorraine's been telling us about?
Well, I'd like to start with the 1980 Housing Act. There was a good thing in there because for the first time the council tenants actually got a secure tenancy. Before that they had permission to occupy. Unfortunately, it was the legislation that introduced the right to buy. And one of the things that's very important about that, of course, there were 33% discounts to buy your council house and 44% to buy your council flat. Now, as Lorraine has already said, this has led to millions of council homes being sold. But what is also very important to understand here is it wasn't the flats that went first. It was the houses, which meant larger families, particularly those with special needs that required housing in houses as opposed to flats, and the disabled were placed in almost immediately in a very difficult position because of the bleed. The second thing about that was, of course, the restrictions on the way in which local authorities could spend the money created by the right to buy receipts. If over the period of the 80s, the government actually prevented them from using it in a whole range of ways, preventing them from actually replacing housing. In direct contradiction, by the way, to what Margaret Thatcher said, was every home that was sold would lead to the resources going in for a house to be built to replace it. Sorry, I would call her a liar. I'm going to swiftly move on then to the 1985 Housing Act, I think it was, which ring-fenced the housing accounts. This is very important because up until then, local authorities used to use some of the rate money to subsidise the housing account to ensure that there were high quality services. The Tories brought that all to an end by actually saying that only money that went into the housing account could actually be used for housing. And the impact of that in terms of what local authorities could do was quite big. Now moving on swiftly to the Housing Act 1988. Now this was the biggie. Because the Tories hadn't had enough right to buy sales and they wanted to dispose of council housing completely, they introduced under the 88 Act the Housing Action Trusts. Now, essentially what it was transferring council housing to quangos with no accountability to local tenants. Now, I will say that tenants fought back admirably against this proposal. Hundreds and hundreds of meetings that I was involved in, explaining the Act, explaining its provisions and how it could impact on council tenants. And significantly, because of the campaigning, they won the right to a ballot some years later. The other thing that is important here is the changes to the security of tenure that were introduced on assured and assured hold tenancies, and the abolition of rent control not only had an impact in the private rented sector, it also had an impact in council tenancies because they had the introduction of probationary tenancies and a whole range of other things. But the other important factor was around Section 21, which is essentially no fault evictions. A landlord didn't have to give a reason to introduce to evict somebody. They just basically had to serve notice. And thousands, I mean, I must have seen hundreds of families who were being evicted, and they were revenge evictions because the tenants had complained about the conditions of housing and the landlord wanted them out because they were being forced into a position of doing something. So they issued a Section 21. But what accompanied this whole thing through the 80s and through to probably the mid-1990s was slashing and burning of council budgets, increasing ring fencing of money so that there was less and less council resources to spend on things, and increasingly the demands of tenants for better repairs, for better and improvements on estates couldn't be met, which of course subsequently led to a whole range of things which I won't go into at this moment in time. We can perhaps pick it up later. But the other thing that happened was that because tenants' demands became quite increasingly loud, council started doing things like saying, well, we're not sure tenants' associations are representative. We're not sure tenants' federations are representative. And thus became the beginning of the slashing of the funding of funding tenants organising for themselves, which of course led to the demise of council tenant organising, despite the fact that they were very successful, that you can't do anything without at least an old Romeo printer to print a leaflet, you know. But there are still some tenants associations that fight, and community fight back is so important on the housing situation. It's the only way we are going to actually be able to impact on everything. So I'll leave it there, and perhaps we can come back to some of the other impacts a bit later on.
I'm sure we will. Lorraine, any comments and examples from your experience at the time, and could you very briefly explain how this legislation took us to the miserable state we're in today?
Well, I think, I mean, it's just, you know, let's put it out there. The right to buy was the largest privatisation of publicly owned assets, probably of all the privatisations that Margaret Thatcher initiated, and that have happened since. I mean, I don't know if it is possible to quantify the book value of the homes that have actually been sold, but my guess is that it probably exceeds, you know, the gas, electric, water, whatever, maybe not all together, but certainly as individual privatisations. And this took it to a new level with the 1996 Act, which introduced buy-to-let mortgages for the first time. And what it also did, and I think you'll probably talk a bit more in terms of financialisation, is it also allowed the banks to get into the property market wholesale. You also had at the same time the demutualisation of the housing associations. So suddenly property became a source of profit, property became a commodity, as opposed to a place where people needed to live, as opposed to fulfilling an essential social function. The whole attitude of the country changed. Its attitude to housing as a whole changed during that period of time, and it was crystallised in that piece of legislation. And the fact that 40% of those public assets are now in the hands of primarily amateur landlords, most of them with just a small number of properties, relatively small properties, but some owning hundreds of ex-council homes, now raking that money in, charging around, certainly the experience in London, at least 3 times what the council would be charging for those rents, and the vast majority of people moving into those properties because they are cheaper. They are still far cheaper than most other private sector rents. They are still well beyond what most people can afford without recourse to housing benefit. And of course, with housing benefit caps, the vast majority of those, certainly in London, will not cover the full cost of the rent. So I think that's been one of the major impacts. We saw an exponential rise during the 80s and in particular the 90s of homelessness, a huge growth in rough sleeping. Rough sleeping has always occurred to a greater or lesser degree, but it was always very small numbers. It was generally older people, people with mental health problems, and very often ex-service people and so on, who ended up on the streets. Every local authority had very large shared provision, dormitory provision for rough sleepers. So in the main, they were got off the streets. That went out the window during the 80s and 90s when a lot of those were closed. And then what we had was the effort of the Blair government to substantially reduce the numbers in temporary accommodation and substantially reduce rough sleeping. And their strategy worked under that government because they resorted to the use of the private rented sector, many of them ex-council properties, in order to get people off the street or in order to get families out of bed and breakfast. With the election of the Cameron government, those gains were completely reversed. We saw private landlords responding to the cap on local housing allowance that was first imposed actually under the Brown government, but was then, housing benefit was basically frozen from 2011 for a number of years. So what we saw was private landlords whose costs were incidentally not increasing because mortgage rates were very, very low. Mortgage costs were very low, interest rates were low, but nevertheless, those landlords wanted their annual rent increase. When they couldn't get that rent increase for people on housing benefit, Section 21 notices were being served. We saw homelessness going through the roof. And where the largest cause of homelessness used to be exclusion from home, so families making their kids homeless, 78% of all homelessness now comes as a result of the ending of an assured short hold tenancy. So the private rented sector is part of the problem. It is not the solution, was never going to be the solution unless there was going to be a bottomless pit. We saw demand side subsidy for housing, which is basically housing benefits, right to buy discounts, not taxing on principal home capital receipts, and so on and so forth, jumping from around £2 to £3 billion to over £11 billion, while the supply side, we essentially saw a reversal of investment in housing, and supply side investment is now at or around what housing benefit demand side subsidy used to be under the previous governments. So, and that's public sector, that is public sector subsidy for private accommodation, essentially.
Lorraine, thanks very much. Let me just clarify there. So about 40% of sold council houses are now in the hands of, you would say, mostly amateur private landlords. And these are now going at about 3 times the council rent in the area.
Yeah.
And we have some serious demand subsidy, and we have a supply contraction. So it's no wonder that things are getting a little bit expensive.
Yeah.
Ruth, I'm going to ask Lorraine the same question as well in a minute. But at the time, who objected to this? And did you guys in the business forecast these problems?
Well, if I can put it this way, the tenants movement and the community campaigning stuff was always very aware of the Tories' legislative agenda, which was all about, very simply put, get rid of council housing, expand the private rented sector, do away with subsidies / council funding. Those four things in combination are what the Tories wanted. And in large part, they were successful. And yes, there were campaigns around a whole range of stuff. But the problem was, by the time the 1996 Act comes along, the voice of the tenants movement had been somewhat muted as a result of the cuts I referred to earlier in funding for tenants' organisations. But there were groups that fought on. The National Tenants Organisation, which subsequently became the Tenants and Residents of England, which became recognised, I think it was the Blair Brown government for consultation purposes, alongside of Defend Council Housing. Now, Defend Council Housing was supported by trade unions and tenants' organisations. And this is a point at which, in around 96 onwards, that tenants' federations started closing. So they were the hubs around which tenants were organising cross-borough and more broadly across England and nationally. And of course, they were attacked in terms of their funding. So yes, there was objections, and organisations like mine, which were Housing Action and campaigning organisations, were linked up with organisations like Shack, Shelter, a whole range of others, including the tenants' organisations, making very clear statements about the consequences of what was going on, and also making clear that the people who were the victims of all of this were the children and grandchildren of those who fought for council housing, and also the new generations coming up were being placed in an impossible financial situation, and the poorest were basically being savaged by what essentially was the cuts in housing benefit and the caps on thing. What's interesting also, of course, is they wanted that the government introduced this mechanism for forcing the levelling up of council rents to the level of commercial and housing association rents. So in an effort to try and screen out the value of council tenancy in terms of a low cost rented property, not mentioning the standards, of course, they tried to drive it up to commercial levels. Now, the devastating effect of all of these things was predicted by many of us, and we were just simply ignored. The Tories just had a steamroller effect. And I have to say also that the trade unions, I think, were slow off the mark. I mean, at one point in my history, I was chair of Unison's housing committee. Also, Unison and a couple of other unions were actually fighting it, but the rest of the unions were fairly mute on it. But quite frankly, in the whole world of pushing for privatisation of everything in the great new green world that would greet everybody was being sold to everybody. And of course, the poorest didn't have a voice. The vulnerable didn't have a voice. The disabled didn't have a voice. And what's very clear is they gave not one jot about that, to be perfectly honest, which is why, I mean, I am going to mention this because it is important, which is why when Grenfell Tower fire happened, you found disabled people living on extremely high floors. Now, that wouldn't have happened. Even in the early 80s, that wouldn't have happened because local authorities understood quite clearly at that time that you cannot place people who are dependent on a lift in a fire situation on higher floors. I'll leave it at that at the moment, and I'm sure Lorraine can add to it.
Yeah, Lorraine, any more on that issue? Anything to add?
Well, I can remember because I was in Southwark at the time, so I started working the housing office in 1985. And there was, I think it would be fair to say, an unspoken agreement between the council and the then Nalgo branch that we would do all we could to prevent the right to buy happening. And in fact, you know, there was kind of a real go slow. Basically, the applications would come in and they went into an in-tray. And eventually, because this was happening in Labour authorities, I think, up and down the country, really, just attempts to stymie the legislation in the hope that she'd get voted out and there'd be a Labour government and they'd reverse it. In the end, the Tory government introduced an element of compulsion and basically made it impossible for local authorities to resist that. In terms of what we knew, I don't think at the time, and I think even when the buy-to-let mortgages came in, I don't think any of us really anticipated the wholesale transfer of that former council stock into the private rented sector. I really don't think we'd anticipated it. The private rented sector had been kind of dead and buried for years because of regulation, because of rent controls, and so on and so forth. And we were concerned, the principal concern, I mean, I was a private tenant at the time, and my Protected Rent Act tenancy was protected at the time that that legislation came in. And it would be fair to say that the private rented sector didn't take off, even with the removal of those regulations, until they could get mortgages in their very large numbers, because the large institutional private landlords didn't exist in this country. They never really did. To the same degree that you see on the continent, where it's perfectly normal, and where, of course, the private sector is generally regulated over there. So the removal of those the removal of those regulations and that regime pretty well laid the ground for, you know, transferring that stock from the people who had been fortunate enough to get those huge discounts over to private landlords. And what I think is also interesting, because there was this kind of 3-year hiatus where tenants who bought their own homes couldn't sell and without having to pay back the discount, was every 3 years, after you had a spike in the right to buy, you also, and this may be coincidental, but you also had a spike in house prices. And I contend that while it may not have been the principal driver, because a lot of the time these also coincided with depressions and with collapses in the housing market, but I contend that the release of all of that equity into people's hands actually helped to drive house price inflation. I'm absolutely certain of it. And in fact, Polly Toynbee yesterday in The Guardian was, commenting on the fact that as soon as you put subsidy into people's hands to purchase homes, the Help to Buy being the most recent and egregious example at the hands of government. But as soon as you start putting public subsidy in people's hands to purchase housing, house prices go up. It's inevitable that they're going to do so. Yeah.
Yeah, I read that article by Polly Toynbee. I think I sent it to you guys, and I was amazed. I thought, my God, she could be a party member. I was about to send her an application form. Now, maybe she's got a bit of a path to travel yet. Right, we talked about financialisation of the market. Let's go ahead and give a few more details here on this, because this is quite an extraordinary story. So, for the first few decades of the post-World War II period, restrictions were placed on lending against property because of concerns about excessive real estate bubbles. Bank lending in general was also well constrained. During this time, the housing market worked pretty well, and many working families were able to get onto the property ladder, including my own, something that my grandparents would never have dreamed of, to be fair. However, by the 70s and 80s, the power of the financial sector lobby had reasserted itself, and the liberalisation of credit and bank markets led the banks to radically change their primary role in modern societies, switching from lending mainly to businesses for investment or to individuals for various purchases, to lending to households for home purchase, taking land as collateral. This shift has both reflected the growing importance of residential wealth in the economy and perpetuated and accentuated that importance. Piketty's Capital 2013, a book I've read twice because, hell, I'm all about the fun, showed that for around 270 years in the UK and in France, residential property wealth varied between 60% and 180% of GDP. Since the 1980s, residential property values have exploded and are now over 300% of GDP in both those countries. In the USA, it's been a bit less dramatic, but residential values have still increased threefold since the beginning of the 20th century as a percentage of GDP. So clearly a fundamental shift has taken place in these economies as housing has replaced farming as the primary economic use of land. Mortgage debt outstanding has increased from around 30% of real disposable income in the UK in 1987 to almost 100% now. Average house prices in 1987 were 4 times disposable income. As we discussed earlier, they're much more than that now. There's a general perception that all this is good for the economy, but a recent assessment of changing living standards since 2002 showed that over half of all UK households since 2002, have experienced flat or falling living standards when housing costs, including mortgage debt and rents, are factored in. All this has been driven by the supply of credit and the entry of the UK's main banks into the deregulated market since the 1980s. In the early 80s, mortgage lending was 20% of GDP. It's now over 60% of GDP. Lending to non-financial firms has stayed at around 20 to 30% of GDP. In 1986, commercial real estate did make up just over 14% of non-financial business lending. By 2014, this figure had risen to almost 60%. It's probably around 70% now, according to most estimates. Non-financial, non-real estate lending has fallen to around 10% of total lending. You got to remember here, banks like mortgage and land-related lending. Not only do mortgage lenders pay back a whole lot more than they owe, land is great collateral. If the borrower defaults, the banks get the house and the land it sits on. Let's talk about house prices and consumption, because people feel better whenever the house price goes up, and they tend to consume a lot more, and they tend to save a hell of a lot less. The required deposits on homes became smaller sometime in the 80s. Now, between 1980 and 1988, the UK household saving ratio fell from 12% to around 5%, while the ratio of consumer expenditure to income rose accordingly. People were spending a whole lot more on the back of the house values. Now, this led to something called Privatized Keynesianism, which is an interesting little thing. Well, I find it interesting, but I don't get out very often. When you look here at home equity withdrawal, people actually taking out loans against the increased value of their property. For the Thatcher government between 1979 and 1990, home equity withdrawal was 263 billion. GDP growth in that stage was 252 billion. So that's where a hell of a lot of the growth came at that time. People taking out big loans on the back of the property increase. Under Blair, home equity withdrawal, 382 billion. GDP growth, 376 billion. So these guys enjoyed serious consumer booms based on rising house prices and the consequent spending uplift. So you can see why governments like all this. A sociologist, a guy called Colin Crouch, described this as privatized Keynesianism, with large injections of mortgage debt via home equity withdrawal, propping up consumer demand in the face of declining median wages, and also reduced support for spending from the government. So this has become a very important part of the economy, and people, the governments now look after those who have homes because they want to maintain their values. Otherwise, they get shafted by a large part of the voting population there. So looking at all that, we have an incredibly complicated and difficult housing market now, which does seem to let down a large part of the population. Do you think that they intended this? Okay, whenever they put these plans together, do you think this was what they wanted to happen? Was this all part of some grand plan to make more people Tory voters because they own houses? Or did the situation come to take on a life of its own and they lost control of it? Ruth?
I don't think there's any doubt that the intention was to break up what they thought were Labour voting blocks on council estates. And the intention, I remember very clearly the words property owning democracy. They thought people would, if they owned their own properties, would be more likely to vote Tory. And in some respects, that's possibly right. And I don't think there is any doubt in my mind that there clearly was an intention to go ahead with these plans with the full intent of actually destroying council housing and public housing, much the same as they have a range of other public services by a combination of legislation, financial controls and cuts. Basically, the change of investment from government over this whole period has been from investing in bricks and mortar for the benefit of the population, basically to investing in landlord pockets and the banks. And the consequence of that for people is huge. And as Lorraine has explained about the buy-to-let, the mortgage, a whole range of stuff that led to the spiralling of private sector stuff. Now, there's been various points at which there's been a little drawback. For example, at one point, I can't remember who it was now, the government was forced into, I think it was under the Labour government, there was a reduction in the amount of discount you could get onto the right to buy because it was basically so huge, it was crippling everybody.
Well, Prescott capped it, sorry to jump in, Prescott capped it at £16,000. He gave his notice of capping it at £16,000, during which there was another spike in sales, after which sales completely flatlined throughout most of the Blair government. There was very little. And then when Cameron came in, he massively increased the discounts again, both in percentage terms and also in cash terms, because of course where the discounts operated before, there was a cash ceiling. And he massively increased that. So 112,000 for properties bought in London was the maximum discount you could get, which is a huge amount of equity to put in somebody's back pocket, huge amount. Sorry.
Just one other thing I wanted to say, which is, of course, that I don't want anybody to run away with the notion that the current housing crisis is just lent upon the Tory legislation. Mainly it has. But also, under the Blair-Brown government, you had the Decent Home Standards introduced. Now, basically, that forced local authorities into a position, unless they could demonstrate they had the resources to bring council estates, which by this time were in the most appalling state of disrepair, up to this Decent Home Standards, they had to transfer it either to a housing association or by ballot of tenants to other organisations. So it's not just, if you like, the Tories who had a hand in the current situation of transferring out council homes. The Labour Party also in government has a hand in this. And I think personally that it was a bankrupt position for the Labour Party to take, because actually it betrayed working class voters. I'll leave it at that.
And just following on from that, I mean, the reason given for doing that, or not given, but the real reason for doing that was to take expenditure on social housing out of the public sector borrowing requirement. And that was why they pushed it. There was more transfers of council housing under Labour, under the Labour government, than there was as a result of the 1988 Housing Act. And that was done as a result of the Decent Home Standard coming in, and local authorities transferred en masse. There are the number of stock owning local authorities is substantially reduced, and the amount of stock that each of those authorities still owns is much, much lower than it was with estates being transferred. Even if the whole stock wasn't transferred, in Greenwich, for example, they transferred the Cherry Orchard estate and Springfield estate and various other estates in Charlton, and created, there was a little housing association created that was linked to Family Housing Association to manage those. And that has happened incrementally. So we saw, for instance, the Ferrier estate being sold off basically to private developers. We saw in Southwark the loss of the Haygate estate. And in fact, in London since 2003, we've seen 13,500 council homes lost to development, in addition to the 20,000 lost since Cameron got elected under the right to buy, just in London alone.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about that in the next episode. Interesting stuff. Lorraine, I don't really get why Labour did this. I can see why the Tories did it, because when you look at the people that have benefited most from this disaster over the last 40 years, it's been the financial sector and it's been the private landlords. And they are the two biggest sources of income for the Conservative Party. Remember, in 2018, Oliver Letwin led some government-led commission and talking about the effect of land hoarding, where they basically buy land. They can keep it. Whenever house prices go up a little bit, then they'll build stuff on there. And that stops people building on the land. So it's a terrible thing to do. People have condemned this for a long time. The inquiry seemed to be saying, I think Sajid Javid actually said, there's definitely some hoarding of land by developers. When the report came out, it said, doesn't really happen, everything's okay, nothing to see here. I can see why the Tories do that. Why Labour? Why does Labour connive in this?
Well, to quote Gordon Brown, prudence. He set himself a series of economic targets. And what I guess they realised is that if they were going to keep council housing in the public sector, if they were going to move back into council house building, that would be a significant require a significant level of investment by government through the use of grant, or it would and it would also require a significant amount of private borrowing by local authorities. And that's basically the justification. It was extremely short-sighted and actually did nothing to assist. I was working full-time in homelessness, and under a large part of the Blair Brown government, and their whole strategy for dealing with homelessness was about utilising the private rented sector. And I mean, there was no other approach to solving the housing crisis than that. When you talk about land, what you see is since 1979, 2 million hectares of public land has been sold to private developers. 2 million hectares. That's the equivalent of 10% of land in Britain, across in Great Britain. 10% of land owned by the public sector, now in the hands of the private sector, and as you said, much of it land banked. If you want to look at the crime of land banking, look at what has happened in Grimsby, on Grimsby docks. When Thatcher privatised all of the docks, and you saw London, the development in London, which is continuing apace, in areas where land values are low, where housing prices are low, you're not getting that development on that privatised land. The other thing that's happened, of course, under Thatcher and under compulsory competitive tendering legislation, which we haven't talked about, we saw the wholesale destruction of direct labour organisations. We saw the loss of design and build departments when council housing stopped being built, as a result of which we've seen a significant loss of expertise within local government. We've seen the loss of political expertise around housing by the introduction of the Widdicombe regulations that stop senior managers taking on elected positions in neighbouring authorities where they lived. Those sorts of things. We've actually seen a demolition, I think, of local government as a whole, as a service provider, and housing has been at the sharp end of that. And of course, housing is the principal cause of people's misery in this country. Poor housing equals poor health outcomes, equals poor education outcomes, equals poor employment outcomes, and it equals depression and so on and so forth. That's the impact, that's the legacy.
We're going to talk about all those subjects more in the forthcoming podcast. Lorraine, thanks very much indeed for that. Now, we come this far as a bunch of lefties without mentioning the European Union, but I feel I have to in connection with that previous conversation there with Lorraine, because people forget. The European Union, I think post-Maastricht, restricts member states to deficit being 3% of GDP. Yeah. And this gave us PFI, and this gave us the pressure on people like Gordon Brown to do things as Lorraine described there, which would reduce the headline public sector deficit. So whenever people talk about those wicked lefties that want to leave the European Union, there were some very good reasons why we wanted to leave the European Union, this being one of them. Okay, that's my regular rant about the European Union. Took later than usual, but glad to get it out of the way. Ruth, over to you for closing remarks, please.
Well, in the forthcoming podcast, I'm hoping we're going to be talking about a much more of the nitty-gritty experiences, and also about what's to be done and how we can campaign. Because what's very clear is we need unity. And we need basically unity. We need the trade unions to step up to the plate. But I think what we achieved today was essentially a run through the legislation and the major criminal actors in all of that, to be quite frank, and the reasons behind it, but also the demise of community organisation and campaigning on these issues and uncovering the reasons why. What I am glad to see is, and it's not been mentioned here today, but I will mention it now, was that there is a rising organisation of private tenants through organisations through the London's Renters Tenants Union and Acorn, etc., which is as a natural consequence of the housing crisis that we have at the moment and the sky-high rents, etc. So hopefully in the next couple of podcasts, we'll talk about a bit more about some of those issues. But overall, I hope people go away with a sense of what happened and why, who was responsible, and hopefully we'll come on to what can we do about it.
We most certainly will, and I think the word criminal is here, maybe even too weak a term, Ruth. Right, thank you very much for that, comrades, and thanks to you for listening. This has been CommieCast. We are anti-capitalist, anti-fascist, anti-racist, but pro-working class. Look out for part 2 of this podcast series on housing. Thank you very much.